We can't see it yet.
Do you now?
Oh, we can see it now.
Great. Lovely. Let me know if you can't hear me or if there are any technical issues. I can't see you all, so hi, the invisible
Right.
crowd. I am very thankful for the invitation, and I'm very sad I can't be with you all today. And just a quick disclaimer before I start is that I am not an academic researcher. So what I'm going to present is one example of people trying to do things to decolonize digital rights and the digital rights field in Europe. Why it seems important is because often when we talk about decolonizing, specifically in the academical sphere, it might look like a conceptual question, which has nothing bad to it, but very detached from practices. And so, hi everyone. And so I think giving an example of how people try to embody things and fail and try again and learn from it might be interesting, hopefully. So with that disclaimer done, one thing I want to say is decolonizing is not a value, it's a process. This is not anecdotal. This means that it is about doing, and more specifically about ways of doing that enable ways of being and not the other way around. It is a process of creating and of world making. Doesn't mean the process isn't based on values, right? There is a clear deontic dimension to any decolonizing process as it concerns what ought to be. It is about imagining and building worlds beyond the current reality we have inherited. The key assumption behind the need to further engage in decolonizing is that colonialism creates damages, some of which will never be repaired. And that is in clear echo to the conversation you had before around the environment. Colonialism is a total project of domination. It is achieved through physical, economical, psychological, and epistemological violence as tool of appropriation of lands, resources, and people in order to increase capital for a minority. I think to dive more into it, you can see, for example, the magnificent book of Sylvia Tamale called Decolonisation and Afrofeminism. The epistemic dimension of colonialism is a key component. It functions by erasing and disqualifying ways of knowing, restraining access to knowledge, and by defining some bodies as never being the knowledgeable ones, following a Western, ethnocentric, racist, ableist, classist, and hetero cis-patriarchal categorization. The epistemic violence, epistemic injustice, as Miranda Fricker coined it, enables and justifies the physical, psychological, and economical violence. Oh, does that work? So to explain why we did what we did, I'm just going to present few forms of tech colonialism and why it makes sense to talk about tech colonialism. It's not a deep dive, so I will give some references in case you wanted to deep dive more, and happy to have a conversation afterward around that as well. But one set of assumption is obviously when you say you want to decolonize is that there is a need for decolonization, that it creates damages. The other set of assumptions when you want to say that you want to decolonize the rights field, for example, is are twofold. One is that digital technologies and the internet are not outside, but rather a product and a continuation of those colonial dynamics. And the second one is that in many ways, one of the tools which could be used to at least mitigate the harms enabled by the coloniality of digital technologies is in reality also often a tool of continuation of colonial dynamics. As I said, for the sake of time, I will only give limited example, of both how tech colonialism takes shape and place, and also how the digital rights field in Europe often plays within colonial framework. And I will, at the end, present what we've been trying out to strengthen anti-colonial capacity with forces committed to digital justice. So, tech colonialism, fun. I will look into two aspects. One is regarding online content, and the other one is regarding infrastructures. Concerning online content, very rapidly, and I invite everyone, if you are not already familiar with their work, to consult the research and resources done by Whose Knowledge on the question of colonial continuum on the internet's content. Let's look at how online content and epistemic injustice are in dialogue. In a summary report of 2019, it stated that though 75% of the world's online population is currently from the Global South, and 45% of all women in the world are online, content online remains heavily skewed toward rich Western countries, and most online knowledge today is accessible only through colonial languages. We, that is Whose Knowledge speaking, estimate that only about 500 of the world's 7,000 plus languages are represented online, with English and Chinese dominating. Google estimates that 129 million books have been published in about 480 languages. At best, then, only 7% of the world's 7,000 language plus are captured in published material. An even smaller fraction of these languages is represented in digital content. Now, infrastructures. I will just give the example of submarine cables. There are many more examples. I know you've had also a conversation around raw material and the Congo, so I think that's very relevant to this conversation as well. But I will just give a very concentrated example on submarine cables because it's very visible. It's very illustrative. So that's a map of the routes of the Atlantic slave trade, as you can see. And that's the map of the Eastern Telegraph Company's submarine. So you can see there are similar patterns. Those are not coincidence, right? It's because once people know the routes, they will use the same routes. And that's the routes of the submarine cables that connect internet. So what we can see is that they are quite similar, and they follow similar patterns. I'm just coming back to the Eastern one. Just a second. Up. So I'm going to dive into some research that Dhanashree Thorat did. And in her article, Colonial Topographies of Internet Infrastructures, the Sedimented and Linked Networks of the Telegraph and Submarine Fiber Optic Internet, she exposes how the development of the telegraph is linked to the politics of colonial control over the Indian subcontinent and only enabled by the exploitation of the raw material of Uttar Persia and indigenous knowledge and labor. So this part is very interesting, very rich, but I will not dive into it. Happy to talk about it afterward if you are interested. But she then zooms in the question of its topographical heritage. And she writes, I quote, the lasting legacy of the telegraph, however, rests in the colonial topography it bequeathed to the global internet network which followed it. While this topography encompasses the geopolitical materiality of cable lines and the undersea routes on which these lines were laid, it also references the deep development inequalities instilled between the colonial empires and formerly colonized nations during colonialism, and often exacerbated under neocolonialism. Inequalities which continue to hinder nations in the global south from owning and benefiting from the internet infrastructures of the undersea cables. So again, here, there's much more to say, as I said, about the different maps and the colonial history of information and communication technology. But I think that gives a bit of context, historical, genealogical context onto why talking about tech colonialism might be relevant. Oh, and just about today, and I will say that in one sentence, and we could actually spend 5 months diving into it, I think, even more. But the technological harms that people are experiencing today are rooted in historical and ongoing colonial dynamics, right? From the exploitation of raw materials to the concentration of wealth in the global north. And one of the key motor of digitalization and the digital market is the militarized and business, right? It's about militarization, about securitization. That is where the most money is of major tech companies. It leads to the reinforcement of the border crisis and the criminalization of marginalized communities by the use of digital tools. And you cannot detach those harms from the historical roots that bequeath to their happening. So that's about tech colonialism very rapidly. And now we're just going to go to the aspect of the digital rights field. So from the harm done because of the coloniality of the production and deployment and business of digital technologies and the ICT complex in general to the field that is supposed to respond and prevent harm from happening. So the current digital rights field sadly actually struggles to address these harms in a way that is addressing the core roots and the colonial dynamics that are at its core. And it's not sufficiently equipped to ensure digital justice for all. What are the challenges that create this situation? So, if the fancy thing, yes. One, we produce, so we being the digital rights field, we produce a lot of long reports and memorandum using academical standards, no shade. Rarely do we use tools to share information and strategies directed at the people directly impacted, so the marginalized communities. Second, when talking about digital issues, we often take the question of justice as an add-on and an accessory, rarely as the lens through which to formulate our analyses and our solutions. Three, a lot of people have already worked with critical visions of tech. Many of them have been participated in this conference, so hi people. Most of the information are scattered and hard to find, while solutionist or individualistic understanding of tech issues and tech remedies are plenty, right? So trying to see how we can influence the consumer instead of looking at how the chain of supply or the means of productions are the ways of that are the things that needs to be changed. Four, the work funded is often to react to an issue, to mitigate harm, which is necessary, right? So for example, we will talk about how there is violence at the European borders in Greece, and that are linked to the deployment of digital technologies. There will be some money given to try and mitigate those harm instead of actually addressing the problem at this core is the huge amount of funding going to the militarization, right? Rarely to fund work to tackle the harm at its roots in ways that are consequential too. That is, we fund to mitigate at the margin, we don't fund to actually address the root causes. Five, a lot of the spaces around digital rights express exclusionary views or function in exclusionary manners. I think a lot of us have been explained that racial justice is an imported ideology from the US, that migrant rights are not a digital rights question per se, that alliances with people publicly wishing harm to racialized, queer, disabled communities are strategical viable choices. I think that's particularly relevant in light of the new composition of the EU Parliament. And all of those things without thinking through what it means for the racialized, queer, and disabled communities, right? 6, the funding processes decide the priorities for the movements instead of the movements deciding on how to deploy the resources. 7, the digital rights organizational structures are often not set up with anti-oppressive policies in their governance that prevents people with expertise in racial, social disability, migrant, and or transfeminist justice who also stem from those communities to have an active role and a central role and stay. And 8, and final, there is no space in Europe at this stage dedicated to tech and justice, where the different justice movements can meet to exchange about the technological aspects of the issues they are encountering in an environment that is designed by them and for them. And that last part is very important. Yeah. So to the decolonizing process and the example that I want to share with you today. Just again, quick disclaimer, wasn't perfect. A lot of criticism can be done. We've done a lot of them ourselves, so no worry, happy to discuss that as well. And very keen on hearing how you all have tried, if some of you have tried processes of change in a similar manner and what you've learned, and just to create an environment of exchange of experiences and practical trying and learning of creating change, right? So what is the decolonizing process? A lot of you might not know, fair enough. I'm going to try and explain it quickly. So 30 plus people from different organizations worked together for over 2 years to design a program for change aimed at addressing the challenges I just mentioned and build a digital justice ecosystem. So an organization like ESWA, so European Sex Worker Alliance, Justice Equity Technology Table, whose knowledge, as I mentioned earlier, State Watch, Queer Archives, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Alternative Bilisim, Homo Digitalis, PICOM, Share Foundation, Glitch UK, Digital Defenders Partnership, International Women's Space, INA, Bits of Freedom, Frauenloop, and also funders, so from OSF, Bosch Foundations, Hivers, SDM, the Trans Fund, and Luminate. So this group of people, photos are still coming up. This group of people work together with a common goal. The goal was to support the strengthening of a field that would prioritize the needs, vision, and interests of communities most affected by technological harm, which are racialized, queer, poor, migrant, disabled, and gender minoritized communities. It was a very long process. I had the pleasure of co-leading it with another person that is called Sarah Chenda, who used to work at EDRI, who now works in her own organization called Equinox. And so the learning of the process were captured in a document that is called Learnings on the Collective Work Rooted in Justice. You can find it on the weavingliberation.org page. There are also videos that document it, a lot of different material accessible. The idea of this blueprint was really to try and create an accountability tool to people and say, we've tried that, those things work, those things didn't work. If we were to do it today, we would do that and that differently, so that we actually participate in the collective bettering of our practices towards liberation and justice. So I will today not present the whole blueprint, no worries, it's very long, but I will just take some of the learnings and try and explain as clearly as possible what the process was And again, obviously, please feel free to ask any questions because often people are more confused at the end of my presentation of the process than at the beginning. So the idea of the decolonizing process, rather than having a simply diversity and inclusion review, came from not being satisfied with just having more people of color in the picture. The aim of the process was to fundamentally change the structural framework that prevents communities who are most affected by technological harm from leading the work on campaigning, organizing, and litigating against it. The process started by engaging in conversation with different racial, social, and economic justice organizations and digital rights organizations based in Europe. So we looked to their experience to understand the current challenges in the field and identify our steps moving forward. This ended up constituting the phase 1 of the process, which we called the scoping phase. Coming from the learnings and the feedback from this scoping phase, we then moved to the design phase, on which I will focus today. The process was meant to be a rehearsal of what we would want to see happen at a larger scale, trying out methods of collective work that would enable us to divest from oppressive modes of functioning. So in March 2020, the Digital Freedom Fund and European Digital Rights, EDRI, embarked on a multi-year process and at bringing together communities impacted by digital harm. The objective of this process was to collectively design a decolonizing program that would radically transform the European digital rights field. The key questions behind the program design were as follows. One, what are the issues with the current field? So what are the issues with the current digital rights field in Europe? I presented some of the diagnoses we made in the challenges. Second, what type of field do we imagine instead? And which activities, spaces, and resources do we create to get to the field we imagine? The 3 questions are rooted in anti-colonial analysis, right? It's about how do we do world ending? So what are the issues with the current field? What do we want to divest from? What do we want to abolish? What type of field do we imagine instead? So that is world making. What do we want to create instead? What type of presence do we want to create, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore would say? And which activity spaces and resources do we create to get to the field we imagine? So that is the action part. It is about how do we organize? How do we put that into action? It is not about only observing. It is also really about putting things in action. As I said, it is about a process, not about a value set. So welcome to the model. This is a process structure. You can see there are 2 of them. One is the original plan, so how we planned it in the beginning. And the second part is how it happened. I don't know if you can see a lot, probably you can't, but what you can probably see still is that between the original plan and as it happened, a lot of things have changed and a lot of things were added. And I think that's a good take already. And the difference between what was planned and what happened is where the learnings took place. So a lot of things I'm going to share are the reasons why between the plan A and the plan B, a lot of things happen. And we thought it was very important to record that because often we don't take the time to look at, okay, how do things emerge and why actually embracing an emergent strategy and leaning into the not knowing is an important part of creating space for creation, imagination, and therefore change. But I'm saying that to researchers, so I guess you all are very, very familiar with that. What happened is the initial timeline and structure changed significantly over the course of the process, responding to the input of participants and the requirements of the work. The 2 main reasons for the changes were, 1, taking consideration of the lived realities of the participants, including care responsibilities, financial precarity, extensive work and activist commitments, and dealing with the private consequences of geopolitical stress. So we deliberately, therefore, departed from an understanding of work performance as being artificially detached from people's lives. We wanted to be embedded in the fact that we are working among people and that people have lives and that things happen, and that also our position inform what type of capacity we have to do things. Second thing was prioritizing needs and healing in the face of harm. So some participants in the process faced issues relating to their physical and mental health, as well as serious concerns about safety and security, all stemming from marginalization in the wider society. We prioritize acknowledging harm and trauma and responding to needs rather than rigidly sticking to a set structure of process that would have added undue hardship in many situations. People. So you can see this is a Zoom room. This is a bit meta, right? I'm talking on Zoom and I'm showing you another Zoom room. Just to explain that we met at the beginning online. The original plan was to have two types of meetings. I'm going to come back to the very nightmarish plan, but just for you to see. Plenary meetings, so those are the pillars in yellow, which will happen 4 times, so 4 plenaries, as you can see. And working groups meeting that will happen in between. So as you can see, those areas. The participants were divided in 5 working groups: organizational, funding, partnership, programmatic, and public engagement. And this model aimed to leave a lot of autonomy to the working groups concerning how they would meet and when. And the aim was to only indicate some deliverables we thought were important. And the assumption behind that is that actually the best liberatory practice was to give a lot of room for self-organization and different methods of organization and a lot of autonomy for people so that they don't feel that there is such a vertical relationship between EDRI and DFF, who were the process facilitators and themselves. And so they would meet in working group, and then the whole group would then meet at plenaries to discuss the work done in working group and give feedback to each other. This plan showed rapidly to have many shortcomings and criticisms. Some of them were very harsh, were voiced during the second plenary. What we did is that we then halted the process and did a round of consultation with each participant, and also drop-in sessions to discuss what they would need to move forward, and also brainstorming among ourselves to see, okay, what is the diagnosis? A key learning for us here was the need to build trust and establish shared values before being able to discuss other things. So one of the things that really every time I explain that, I'm like, obviously, but at the time it wasn't that obvious, it was a lot of people and they didn't know each other, a lot of them before. So if they came from very different practices and areas of activities, they all had very different motivations for joining the process, as well as different relationships to colonialism. I think if we were to do exactly the same exercise as we did in the room you are in, it would be very interesting to know what people see as their relationship to colonialism, what is their own history to colonialism, how they can identify that, etc. And therefore also very different levels of awareness regarding its impacts in their lives. Secondly, participants had very busy schedules and their organizational and their own organizational and personal priorities, right? So we were trying to gather people to do one thing, and they were like, is that my priority? Why would I invest time in that? Why is that important to do that in that context? And also it was very difficult to carve out time to plan meetings, right, for the participants, never mind actually attending them. Those are all very normal issues that we all have. The question is like, what do we do when we admit that time is not an equally distributed resource, but actually is very determined by our positionality. In addition to that, the start of the design process came at a point where people had devoted over 1 year to working through online meetings, and many people were burnt out by the increased work intensity and lack of human contact inherent with this method of working. These factors, as I said, frequently led to people of color in the group either shouldering a disproportionate share of the burden because they saw the value of such a process. They saw how that could impact their lives positively in the long run. And they were very invested for multiple reasons, but a lot of them were their personal understanding of their history to colonialism. Or, and that was the other side, in many cases, those people of color completely disengaged from the process, especially when they also belong to smaller anti-racist and or feminist organizations. So because it felt like a burden, it wasn't clear why they would take on this load. Some people disengaged from the process, and there were people that didn't belong to organizations that were well funded, that were mostly people that were doing that as a volunteer, or even if they were funded organizations, there were organizations that were already very much doing frontline work and had to deal with many emergencies. So made it complicated to have even the space to just engage with, okay, if in 5 years the field should change, what should it look like? Another learning is that the conflict of the plenary was actually very beneficial. So the criticisms that were voiced during the plenary, although they felt very harsh at the time, coming from people that we have great relationship with now, they were actually very beneficial. Very cute image, sorry. What? So what we learn is that when a conflict arises, it is important to not brush over or minimize it, but rather to halt things and take time to examine what created the conflict. The urge to always have a peaceful and civil process can also serve as a tool to maintain oppressive dynamics. Whether those dynamics are intentional or not, a direct challenge in processes like this can indicate many things, from the need to make mental health support available for individuals to completely redesigning the mode of organization. At the very least, such challenges highlight misalignments or overlook problems in the design. However, if challenges are taken seriously, and they often are not, right? But if they are taken seriously, if conflicts are taken seriously as an opportunity, they can open the door for clarity and prompt us to ask important questions, such as, why are we here together? How are we feeling while we are here together? Are we agreeing on where we are going together? From these questions, we generate new and better ways of organizing. Learning how to prepare for and manage conflicts without alienating or exhausting the individuals involved in the discussions and organizing of the space is crucial. This is one of our biggest learning and a skill we wish we had more knowledge and practice. And I don't know if there are people in the room that have a lot of knowledge in how to use conflict as a transformative tool, or do research on that as a way of actually building better technologies and better ICTs. But I would be very interested in having this conversation. Creating space for conflicts in a work context also challenges the notion of professionalism. It is important to recognize that this notion is deeply embedded in white supremacy and ableism. Who can afford to always stay calm, but the ones for whom the system has been designed to function? While not every conflict requires a complete halt, right? We stopped, but like it doesn't mean every time there is conflict, everything needs to stop. We learned that agendas need to be changed to address the issue whenever a subject touches on the fundamental way of functioning of a collective process. Accepting conflict as a transformative tool also means putting the necessary care infrastructures in place to ensure that people do not burn out while working through the conflict. So I think like that was a big learning for us. Very keen on hearing how it is in your work. So what we did after all this conflict, listening to people, having the drop-in sessions, having the one-on-one, many things changed. For one, we created a track of peer learning sessions based on the subject both relevant to each working groups and of interest to the participants. So we had sessions on trauma-informed organizing, abolitionist tech and vision from the Global South, decolonial practices and decolonial leadership, and we had one session around funding called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. This is a reference to a book that some of you might have read, and if not, I really encourage you to read it. It was done by the collective Insight. The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. Second, we reinforced artistic practices. So we had an artistic support that designed sessions during plenaries. So you can see on the photo, we did like collective painting. We did Afrofuturist creative writing. We had an artist coming in to do T-shirt making workshop, etc., etc. Why it was important? Because it was, again, about divesting of from the idea that knowledge production and accessing knowledge is only valuable if through rationality or European form of producing knowledge, through the written form, through data, quantitative data, etc. So enabling to produce knowledge and build trust and build actually community through artistic practices felt very important in that process. Third, we took a more active role in organizing meetings for participants. So as I said in the beginning, we wanted to give them more autonomy. We switched gear. They were all said, like, we don't have time to look at calendar. If you can organize slots where we can all meet, great. So we did that. And another thing we did that changed is that we were not giving exercise for people. So people didn't have to work outside of when we met, but more we tried to carve out time when we met for the work to happen. And that also allowed people to actually free up time for themselves. And we moved from online meetings at the beginning to in-person plenaries. As you can see, we are in person. One happening in Italy, so that's the painting ones, and the people on the floor doing weird gesture one. And the other one in Morocco. So this is the one on the roof and the beautiful group picture. All of these things enable different things, also switching from having or asking for people to only be there to give inputs, to just give their knowledge, outcomes and stuff like that, to actually creating learning spaces. So that was the peer learning sessions, but also the creative sessions. It enabled people to discover themselves, to discover things in themselves that they didn't have the time to just touch upon, having conversations with themselves that they didn't have the opportunity to have because of the grind of the work, and have also discovered each other under like new suns, as we like to say. So often, because we are in this NGO professional environment, it was a lot of people were NGO people, but a lot of people also were researchers. There is this mask of professionalism that we wear, and it really hard that move away from that. So those exercises also enable new forms of conversation to happen. So that all of that enabled people who had very different practices of work, came from very different organizing background, and worked on different topics to build link and community. So often we will hear community. I'm part of the academic community. I'm part of the digital rights community. I'm part of XYZ community. Community has different meaning, right? It's a polysemic term, but if you are invested in actually building community, it demands action, right? It demands to be in community. And that again, like demands to build trust, build knowledge, and build solidarity with one another. It's not something that you declare, it's something that you do, and you hope it works. This group of people, beautiful people, is still very much in contact today. So we meet each other in different places. We have a shared group. We do projects together, etc. So that has very much created this community of people that before didn't work together necessarily. And also because it was one of the key goals at the beginning, it enabled the production of a program for change. And this program for change was very much informed by what we all went through and lived through and experienced. This program is called A Vision for Digital Justice Organizing in Europe. Again, it's also available on the website of weaving-liberation.org, and you can look into it a bit more. And this program looks to shift the frameworks of knowing and doing, and based on the recognition that the ways we understand issues produce knowledge, and which people groups and approaches are prioritized need to change, right? That's what we said before. And if we want to actually get to a place where we can really engage with anti-colonial work, we need to change a lot of things before the conditions of getting into anti-colonial work. So understand that we need to center the margins in terms of how the ecosystem does its work. So it is about looking to redistribute power, resources, how spaces of convening are designed, how agendas are for change come to life, etc., etc. And also recognizing the need to address the cooptation of language around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and rather look to narratives and ideas anchored in practice of reparation, decolonization, and justice. So the program, and I will not dive into the whole program. You can, again, look into it. It's online, but some of the parts could be interesting to some of you. And the aim of the program is also to create synergies between creating new forms of partnerships and enabling new forms of partnerships. And so it is also an offer to a lot of people. So if you are intrigued or interested in one of our multiple parts of the program, just reach out to us and let's see how we can coordinate work or put people in contact and stuff like that. It's really about creating this energy and having a wider and wider community coming together. So 3 pillars. 1, imagining through collective community-centered knowledge. As I said, decolonizing is a world-making endeavor. As such, imagination is an integral part of liberation, and the activities under this pillar set out to uplift and make accessible knowledge and practices that already exist. So we acknowledge that a lot of people have already been doing a lot of work at the intersection of tech and liberation and justice from an anti-colonial critical framework, but that it's hardly accessible. So we want to participate in making it more accessible, gather it, classify it, etc. And we also want to create spaces where people can actually scope and create and build the knowledge that they need and the way they need it. So that would be community-centered knowledge. So putting communities and researchers and experts in contact, but the leading and the driving force in those spaces would be communities and their needs. Second, organizing solidarity. organizing solidarity is the second pillar, which with activities focused on ensuring that communities primarily affected by tech harm have the infrastructure, the space, and the resourcing to set the agenda of digital justice work and explore solidarity practices. So organizing solidarity is also about creating synergies across movements, enabling movements to meet and discuss and see and create a common vision, right? So if we were to imagine the environmental justice movement in conversation with the trans feminist sex workers movement, with the anti-racist movement in Europe, talking about tech and imagining what type of information and communication technologies they would need and what time they would dismiss, what would it look like, right? And I think right now we are not very informed by that agenda because of the lack of spaces and opportunities for those people to meet and create those agendas. So that's one of the key pillar. Third one is supporting and sustaining movements. So what we know is that the only thing that brings about change in life and in the world historically are movements. And so if we want things to change, we need to support movements and we need to invest in supporting movements and sustain them so that people don't leave. And so this third pillar is about structurally changing the way resources are allocated in the ecosystem. So to create and sustain new roles, infrastructures to better support movements. I don't know, how much time do I have? I have the feeling I've been rambling for a lot of time, but
So you have, well, we started a little bit late, so you have up to 2 or 3 more minutes. We would then have a bit of time for questions. How long would you like, ideally? It's just because we have lunch after this, and we could extend it a little bit.
no, I don't need more time. It's also never ask me this question. I can just kidnap people for 3 hours more.
Brilliant. Well, if you like, it might
Never
be
ask me that. 2 minutes, I can do it.
Yeah, so 2 minutes and then maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
lovely. I'm the queen of rambling, so I can ramble for a long time. Okay, where was I? The changes we hope to see. More space, time, and resources to imagine, explore, and pilot alternatives ideas for joyful, liberatory digital futures. Exciting. Does it work? Yeah. More resource spaces to explore question methodologies, centering other forms of knowledge and knowledge production. So really trying to get into the hermeneutical question, how do we produce knowledge, the epistemological questions as well. Access to existing knowledge and practices to learn from. So making sure that there is a wider access to critical knowledge around tech so that we decenter the tech solutionist hegemony that we are suffering under at this time, and that we actually center knowledge that are about analyzing tech within context. Dedicated spaces to heal, strategize, learn from each other, and build solidarity. So this cross movement, building bridges, building partnership. Space to imagine funding practices. Dedicated repository of resources to facilitate cross-community learnings and collaboration. So when new resources are produced, to try and find a place where we can deposit them so that they are easily accessible. And again, agendas for change shaped by those most impacted. Tailor support for building anti-oppressive and transformative practices in existing organizations and movements. So some of the learnings we had is that actually nothing is, you can have the best intentions, but if you don't have the practice, it's complicated. And there are a lot of people that have great knowledge and practices. They're often not in contact with the people that have the great intentions. And so how do we put people in contact so that we flex our muscles of being transformative in our practice and not only in our intentions? And then, yeah, individuals and coalitions dedicated to weave relationship strengthening efforts and sustain the work toward digital justice. And I think that's the end. And so happy to hear questions and but also sharing and rambling and everything.
Fantastic. Let's start with a round of applause. So, do we have any questions? I think we have one, two, three. Yeah, quite a few. Let's get started at the front here.
Thank you very much for the presentation and thank you for sharing with us the process. My question is that I have the understanding that there might be some different ways of decolonization because there were different colonization practices through different times, different places, throughout different generations. How do you feel in your experience that they communicate with each other? Because I feel that we live in a society based on mondialization and it's very international now, but I feel that decolonization is a very community-based discussion and process. So I would just like to hear you talk about this.
Do I respond directly to each question or is it an assembling of the questions? Just
Directly to each question.
okay, great. I think that's one of the tension, right? And decolonizing is about navigating those tensions and those contradictions because on the one hand, there are different phenomenons of colonization. They have taken different shapes. And on the other end, they all have very similar patterns, right, of how to function. And that's how you know when there is a continuity of the colonial dynamics or the colonial powers. One of the things that we can say is that the movement for independence in the 50s, starting at the end of the 40s, 1940s, and until the 70s that happened, those movements were global movements, right? And they inspired each other. So that's one thing is like, how do we create dialogues? And how do we create sets of opportunities for people to discuss without having the need to be hegemonical to be relevant? I don't have the answer to this very tough question. But what I can say is that what we try to do within the process is really to lean into what does it mean to navigate the need between decentralized forces and having a common vision. And that's one of the things, right? It's like we can have a common vision and we can have a multiplicity of tools. If you look historically, that's what happened. They had alignment on common visions that were developed from the end of the 19th centuries until like the mid 20th centuries. If you look at historical anti-colonial movements, shared visions about like what it would look like, independence, national states, etc., etc. Very much the same type of advocacy alignment at the national, what's the name of Société des Nations in English? I don't know, sorry. But at the precursor to the United Nations, they were also aligning on that. There were like common resolutions written, so shared visions. But then the tactics that were deployed internationally were very different, and they were actually dependent on the context. Some of them were inspired by others, but also very anchored in the context. And I think that's one step we are not at right now, and we could work on before moving on to anything else, is how do we build this shared vision, this shared understanding? How do we act in coherence and not actually in competition and in contradiction? Those are steps that I see could be useful, and the rest is going to be fine-tuned and we're going to discover as we go along, right? And that's also the importance of emergent strategies.
Thank you.
Where else have we got? Just there, I think. Is there somewhere in the other corner as well? Is it? Oh, just there, I think.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. My question was about the composition of your working groups. If I understood well, you said that you had quite a diversity in terms of relation to decolonisation and reason to be here. I have the feeling that one of the critics of participatory research is to be biased in terms of social classes, because people are volunteers, so it's people who feel comfortable with this kind of process and stuff like that. So you've got a bias. Is it right? Did you manage to, well, to avoid that? And if so, how? I wonder.
I don't know if we completely managed to avoid that. I think there was different set of people that most of the people had academical degrees, so that's like that says a lot about your social economical positioning as well. So that is one thing that we didn't tackle fully. And I don't know how we would have with this restricted number of people and stuff like that. Again, not a perfect process. One thing that enabled a bit to mitigate that was working with grassroots organizations that were formed out of a need. So, for example, if you take International Women's Space, it's an organization in Berlin that is a feminist migrant-led organization. So that was created at a moment where they were mobilizing, again, a specific set of laws in Germany that prevented them to move and also to access residency status. So they were very much created because there was a specific need. And so that created actually a set of individuals participating in that was very different from other organizations that would be created out of intellectual understanding of a problem. And so with that group, for example, we had a different set of participants. Some of them had degrees, but there are degrees that were not European degrees, which again creates other dynamics. And also their work was not the work of like classical academical trained people in Europe. So I think that created other things. We work with the European Sex Worker Alliance. Here again, there was like some of the people had high the academical degrees, some others didn't. So it was again another patchwork of participants. And I think that those are the things where obviously you're not going to mitigate everything, but it does create new friction or new dynamics, more so than when you do participatory research in a way where, yeah, I don't know. And some participatory research work actually are excellent, so I don't want to, but yeah, I think those are the things. And again, we also are looking at how can we do better next time, right? So what can we learn from what we did? How can we reinforce the things that worked? And how can we just divest from the things that didn't work?
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Do we have any other questions? No, I think that'll be all.